Relic of the Mad Poet, written by E.H. Robinson, narrated by Ian Gordon. A Journey to the Tree of Sorrow story, created by David LaRocca and Heath Robinson. Copyright 2018 by Infinite Black. Somewhere along the eastern bank of the Sea of Galilee, AD 743. No light came from the cracks in the shuttered windows. Faisan tried the door, but it did not budge. He beat upon it, and, to his surprise, it opened a few seconds later.
"Praise be to Allah,"
his servant, Asghar, said, clasping his hands together in a pious gesture. The sandstorm had grown increasingly fierce since the ghouls attacked them on the road, and now there was a chill in the air as the sun was sinking. It seemed they had reached the house just in time. The portico would not have been shelter enough for them overnight, but it would have to suffice for the camels. Faisan stepped through the door, sword in hand, but there was no one there. He coughed with the pain of his wound. His lamellar cuirass had protected him from the worst of his assailant's savagery, but the feral ghoul's dagger-like claws had nevertheless stabbed him under the arm, right above the line of his armor. Faisan had felt its claws slide between his ribs and puncture his lung. In response, the creature living inside Faisan had jerked, and its shrill screech had reverberated through his bones. Despite fighting it just as much as the ghoul, Faisan had brought his sword down upon the ghoul's head, burst its skull, and spilled the worm-like ooze it had for brains in the sand. Though the wound Faisan had sustained was savage, the ghouls had done far worse to Habibi, the second servant who had travelled with him. They had surrounded Habibi and torn him apart. When Faisan and Asghar fled, Faisan had looked over his shoulder long enough to see the creatures hunched over Habibi's body, preparing to make a meal of him. When Faisan coughed, the creature inside him squirmed. It had grown steadily over the years, drinking his blood and leaching the nutrients from his body. He could feel its slippery form slide between his organs. As it had grown larger, Faisan had grown more sickly. It had been years since the disfigured sorcerer had conjured the thing inside him, but ever since that moment, Faisan knew death was coming. There wouldn't be room in him for it much longer. He often dreamed of a bloody slit opening across his abdomen. He would watch the hissing hellspawn emerge from his entrails before it clamped its massive jaws down over his face. He always jolted awake just as it crushed his skull with its powerful bite. Yes, death had always been coming. It was just coming more quickly now that the wound the ghoul had given him had angered and agitated the creature. At least, if his wound was mortal, the thing inside him would perish with him. When he left with Asghar and Habibi in search of this place, he had left his only child, a daughter who had been born only a week before. Faisan had kissed her goodbye, never expecting to see her again. He would never have lived to see her grown anyway. He was not sure what kind of world she would live in, but he did know one thing for certain. If she was to grow up without her father, it would be a world without at least one other person, the man who had done this to him. Faisan's hatred for the sorcerer had burned hot for so long, and now, as he entered the house, he could taste vengeance. Perhaps it was only the taste of his own blood in his throat, but that was close enough. He is here, Faisan thought as he adjusted his grip on his sword. Even if it was the very last thing he did before he died, he was going to drive it through the sorcerer's black heart. We'll see how well his magic works when he is impaled by a cubit of iron. The doorway opened into a chamber where the embers of a fire burned low. They gave off only a little warmth and a faint red glow. The room was small and sparsely decorated, but neatly kept. A writing desk suitable for a seated scribe was near the fireplace. A brush, ink, and rolls of paper were carefully stored.
"Hello?"
Asghar called as he stepped in behind Faisan.
"Is anyone here?"
There was no answer. All was silent. Asghar had been none too eager to accompany him on this sojourn to a haunted mosque, but after the physical horrors they had encountered upon the road, it seemed Asghar preferred to take his chances with the spirits rather than remain with the sandstorm and the ghouls. To the right of the door was a large archway decorated with colourful tile. It opened into a large room, evidently a prayer hall. There were also doors to the left, but they opened into sleeping chambers and a small dining room. Beyond the chamber was the structure's internal courtyard. Everything seemed empty and quiet, but then Faisan became aware of another presence in the room. Staring at them, from the doorway to the courtyard, was a jackal. Its eyes glinted with moonlight, even though there was none to catch. It swayed slightly as it watched them. Then it turned to pad silently out of the chamber. As the beast turned, Faisan saw a long and deep but bloodless wound on its flank. Faisan lowered his sword, and he and Asghar shook their clothes free of sand and unwrapped the cloth they had used to shield themselves from the elements. Faisan's clothes were dark with blood, and he touched his hand to his side, pulling away bloody fingers. He breathed with a wet rasp. Blood was welling in his lung.
"Master,"
Asghar said with concern when he saw the blood. He started for him, but Faisan waved him off with an air of resignation. "Later," Faisan said. "Get the fire going." Asghar did as he was bid and stoked the fire. With sword again in hand, Faisan entered the prayer hall. The room was decorated with colourful tiles arranged in elaborate patterns. There were no furnishings. The whole structure had probably been the villa of a Roman aristocrat. Its Roman origins were apparent in its layout and foundational architecture, but it had been heavily modified. Those modifications had included the conversion of this room into a prayer hall and the addition of an intricate mihrab in the wall beyond. Faisan hobbled across the hall to the mihrab. It had an odd look, with decorative calligraphy and what appeared to be the motif of an abstract dark tree interwoven with the side pillars. As Faisan touched a pillar, the thing inside him seemed strangely soothed. For a moment, his breath came easier. He ran the pads of his fingers over what seemed to be a waving tree branch. As he did so, the familiar and easy voice of the thing inside him vibrated through his bones with an alien hiss. "Felweg Shagor, Felweg Shagog, Nug Felweg Shakar, Yog-Sothoth Kadishtu Nilgrila." It had spoken these words before. They were a familiar refrain, but this time it seemed to speak them more stridently. Faisan's eyes followed the tree design, from the mihrab up to the large but shallow dome above him. A mosque's dome was always an abstract representation of heaven, but there was something odd about this one. The stars it suggested were strangely arranged with large balls of light connected by a web of lines.
"Master,"
Asghar said from the other room.
"look at this."
Faisan pulled his gaze from the dome and passed back into the other room. The fire was burning more brightly now. Asghar had shuffled through some of the papers on the scribe's desk, and he held one up. It displayed a sketch of a man bound to a table. Coiled in his torso was a tentacled beast with a single eye, drawn in red ink. Faisan snatched the paper from Asghar. He stared at it in disbelief for a moment, then growled, tore the paper to pieces, and threw the bits in the fire. Then he grabbed the stack of papers on the desk and threw them at the fire as well. Only a few made it in. The rest scattered around the room. The sudden exertion got the better of him, and Faisan fell into a blood-splattering coughing fit as the creature constricted around his lungs. Asghar was by him in an instant and put his arm over his shoulders.
"Master, please lay down. I will look for something to help you."
Faisan grabbed Asghar for support as he doubled over and coughed again.
"Master, look!"
Asghar said, indicating the scattered papers. They were moving slowly, as if picked up by unseen hands. They drifted back to the scribe's desk, where some unseen force was neatly ordering and restacking them. "Greetings, travelers," a smooth voice behind them said. Faisan and Asghar turned. A man stood in the archway to the prayer hall. He was dressed in a simple robe and had a thin black moustache that matched his stringy black hair. Faisan tried to control his coughing fit.
"Thank you,"
Asghar said. There was an awkward silence as the papers flickered in the fire behind them and the others were organizing themselves on the desk. Asghar continued timidly.
This is my master, Faisan Massoud, nephew of the Caliph. I am his servant, Asghar. Thank you for your generosity. Who do we address?
Are you Abdul Alhazred? Faisan asked in a guttural voice as he wiped the blood from his mouth and straightened. The man laughed, almost to himself. No, I am not Alhazred. I am Rahaz al-Nahas. He gestured to Faisan's bloody side. Perhaps I can be of assistance. I think not, Faisan said. His skepticism of the man was undisguised.
We were watering our camels not far from here when we were set upon by the most hideous creatures,
Asghar said.
Truly, I did not know there were such things in the world until I saw them myself. There was another with us, Habibi, but the creatures slew him. We barely escaped.
Ghouls, Rahaz said. The door's heavy beam slowly lifted from the floor and set itself in place to bar it. Cease your magic, wizard, Faisan scowled. I have business with Alhazred, he said as he grunted with pain. The creature inside him twisted. And I have it by good authority that he is here. Is this not true? Rahaz walked toward Faisan with his arms out, indicating concern for Faisan's wound, but also respect for the sword at his side. Please, Rahaz said. Faisan did not resist, and so Rahaz touched Faisan's side with delicate care. The creature in Faisan's chest growled, and it echoed in his skull. Rahaz withdrew his hand and looked up at him. It seemed Rahaz had heard the creature too. Alhazred is here, Rahaz said. I must speak with him. I think you do not want that. Faisan drew his sword and held its point beneath Rahaz's chin. Take me to Alhazred. Rahaz raised his hands to indicate he posed no threat. Very well, he said. If it is Alhazred you seek, then it is Alhazred you shall find. He slowly backed away and held his hands wide. But only you. Follow me. Faisan nodded his indication for Asghar to remain. Rahaz spoke to Asghar. Do not open the door for any reason, he said.
Of course not,
Asghar said. It seemed impossible that someone would approach with the sandstorm still going on. The wind still blasted the outside of the structure, and he heard the camels grunting. Rahaz walked toward the mihrab, and Faisan followed. As he approached, the mihrab's back wall silently swung open, revealing a stairway cut down into the rock. A burning torch was in a bracket just inside. Rahaz stepped in and took the torch. Do not disturb us, Faisan said to Asghar.
No, master, of course not. I will pray for Habibi's soul,
Asghar said. I do not think Allah will hear your prayers here, he said, indicating the dome of the prayer hall with his eyes. He turned to follow Rahaz, and when he had passed through the door, the mihrab closed. Rahaz was already descending. The stairs were narrow and unevenly cut. At times, there was such little headroom that Faisan could not stand straight. Rahaz, however, clearly knew these stairs well, and he moved swiftly downward with the torch. Where does this lead? Faisan asked to Rahaz's figure silhouetted in the torchlight. All the way to the sea, Rahaz called back. If you care to go that far? They descended some way until they came to a place where the stairs continued down to the left, but to the right was a small landing with a wooden door with iron studs. Alhazred's chamber, Rahaz said, gesturing dramatically at the door. Faisan felt himself tense and the hairs on his neck raise. This was it. His hand moved to the hilt of his sword. Rahaz took note, but seemed unconcerned. Rahaz opened the door and stepped inside. Faisan followed him. Beyond the door was a chamber lined with shelves filled with scrolls and sheaves of parchment. In a corner of the room, a fire burned in a fireplace that used some fissure in the rock as a chimney. Across from them, a doorway opened to a dark chamber beyond. There were several wooden tables in the chamber, covered with all manner of alchemical apparatuses. Several flasks bubbled and issued fog of different colors. It spilled over their lips, rolled across the tables, but then dissipated before striking the stone floor. The dried husks and bones of desert creatures laid here and there, and a skeleton of a bat was fixed to a board. To one side was the main work table. A circle of runes was carved into the floor, so that someone working at the table would be at its center. A large book sat on a lectern, easily accessible from the table. But most striking was what sat in a niche in the wall above. Glaring down from its perch and surveying the room was a grey skull with empty eyes. It was crowned with an intricate diadem of vertebrae, topped with spire-like finger bones. Rahaz gestured with a flourish toward the skull. "May I present to you Abdul Alhazred?" Faisan's eyes narrowed as he approached the skull. He glared at it. Thin silver wire threaded through the bones and held the crown together. Runes had been carved into the skull's forehead, evidently when the bone had still been fresh. If this was indeed the skull of Alhazred, then the last time he had looked upon it, it had still been surrounded in living flesh. That had been long ago. He had been chained to a table, staring up at Alhazred's disfigured face, when the creature had been summoned into him. "What is this?" Faisan turned to Rahaz and spat blood. "You lie!" Without warning, the creature inside him constricted around his lungs, and Faisan cried in pain. He tried to draw what little breath he could, as he collapsed to his knees before the table. Faisan's heart pounded, and a fever struck him. Sweat ran from his forehead, and his head throbbed. He looked up at the skull and stared into its eye sockets. Words echoed in his mind, the very words Alhazred had spoken that day the creature was put inside him. Memories surfaced that he had thought were long banished to the darkest recesses of his psyche. As Faisan looked back at the skull, the disfigured flesh that had once covered it appeared in a haze. It was Alhazred. There was no way he could forget that face. He hated it even more than he hated the thing twisting inside him. And now, once again, Alhazred looked down upon his helpless form. Blood was flowing into his lung, and he could feel himself drowning. Faisan turned his head and vomited a stream of blood upon the stone. The next thing he remembered was laying on the floor in a swirl of pain and fever. There was a demoniacal laugh. It must have come from the skull. Then the pain and fever subsided, and he saw Rahaz looking down at him. "I do not," Rahaz said calmly. Faisan coughed and used the table to haul himself to his knees. He looked up at the skull. The vision of the flesh was gone. Once again, only the cold bones surveyed the room. "Then I have been cheated?" "Cheated by none but death," Rahaz said. Then more quietly, "But death cheats most of us in the end." Faisan tried to regain his composure and got to his feet. Rahaz continued, "Abdul Alhazred was slain in Damascus some years ago. I was there when it happened, as were hundreds of others. It was in the city's main square. Alhazred was prophesying the doom of the Umayyads. Blasphemy, of course, but no one dared touch him as he spoke. Alas, as it turns out, not even great Alhazred could keep the powers he invoked at bay forever. As Alhazred prophesied and pronounced his doom, the crowd was transfixed in terror as an invisible horror from beyond eviscerated him and tore him apart before their eyes. We were used to the violence worked upon bodies by sword, spear, and axe, because we see and understand the instruments of the violence, but Alhazred's death had no seen cause. Had it not been great Alhazred who was struck down, I might have even regarded the creature's work as artful. It painted the square red with Alhazred's life's blood." Rahaz made a sign with his hand. Blessed are all those who were splattered by it and tasted the salt of his blood on their lips. When it was over, the people ran, but I did not. I was in the square alone with Alhazred's shredded body laying on the fountain steps. No one would have tended to it. Great Alhazred deserved better than to be left for the carrion, so I took his body and brought it here." Rahaz turned to indicate the carefully crafted clay jars in other niches around the chamber. "His lungs," Rahaz said, pointing to one sculpted in the likeness of a baboon. "His liver," he said, pointing to another in the likeness of a woman. "What I could recover of his intestines, and all that was left of his stomach, all carefully packed in salt and natron." When Rahaz spoke of the stomach, he indicated a jar with a lid in the form of a jackal. Rahaz seemed pleased with himself. "What are the runes?" Faisan asked, gesturing at the skull's forehead. "To preserve his mind, at least as much as could be done. It took longer than I would have liked to get him here, or I could complete the preservation rituals. I pulled his brain through his nose with a hooked wire, and used it to cast the spells I knew." Faisan turned to Rahaz with a less threatening posture. "These funerary proceedings are not in accordance with Muhammad's directives." "No," Rahaz admitted, "but there are powers other than Allah that concern Alhazred, and me, far more." Faisan felt the thing inside him squirm. There are indeed. Faisan reached for the pages of the book beneath the skull, but Rahaz grabbed his wrist. "Are you sure you want to do that?" Faisan looked at him. "Have you read it?" "Of course, but things once read cannot be unread." "I do not fear the written word," Faisan said, "not after dealing with all that I have." "Very well," Rahaz said, releasing his wrist. Faisan turned to the book. It was written in a fine and careful calligraphy, not unlike what might be found in a great literary edition of the Koran, but its pages were far less decorative, and the ink was not the jet-black ink of a scholar, but something different. Faisan touched the pages. As he did so, he felt the draw of the skull and the weight of its hollow gaze upon him. The thing inside him twisted as his eyes fell upon the phrase, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die." Faisan whispered the words to himself, but as he did so, he heard them echo in an evil voice, as if spoken in his mind by the skull above him. Faisan slammed the book shut and lifted it from the lectern. He started toward the fireplace. "What are you doing?" Rahaz asked, interposing himself between Faisan and the fire. "Away from me, wizard," Faisan said. He slapped Rahaz across the face with his free hand. "This will die with me." He charged toward the fire, but collapsed as the creature inside him stopped his breathing and squeezed his heart, stifling his heartbeat. Faisan fought desperately to draw breath. Alhazred's laughter howled in his skull, and the thing inside him squirmed and twisted. Faisan's body contorted with it. With what strength he had, he threw the book toward the fire, but a violent reaction from the creature arrested the throw. The book tumbled before the fireplace, and Faisan went sprawling upon the floor. Faisan strained, stretching to push the book toward the fire. The creature inside him squeezed his lungs and heart tighter. It felt as if his eyes were going to pop from his sockets. The tips of Faisan's fingers gave the book a final nudge toward the fire before Rahaz picked it up. Rahaz held it out, and some unseen force lifted it from his hand. The book drifted back to the lectern, where it was replaced with the utmost care. Then Rahaz knelt by Faisan, and he touched his forehead. The thing immediately released Faisan's heart and lungs, and he gasped for air. "Death would be a release to you, I think," Rahaz said, touching him on the cheek, and then feeling his pulse in his neck. Rahaz sat back on his heels. "Alhazred is dead. You will never have your vengeance. And what's more, there is no doctor in the Caliphate who could cure what ails you. But I am no doctor, and if you want to see your daughter again, the only one who can help you is here in this room. Now tell me, do you really want to die?" Faisan hesitated uneasily as he pondered the question as he lay on the stone floor. He had seen death as inevitable for so long, but then he thought of his wife holding his daughter, nursing gently. "No," he admitted, "I do not." "Then let me find out what he did to you." Rahaz inclined his head toward the skull as he spoke. "We'll start by inspecting this wound. I can help you." "If you do, then will I live to see my daughter grown?" Rahaz touched the back of his hand to Faisan's forehead, and then laid his fingers over his heart. "You will see your daughter grown." Faisan relaxed. "Very well then, do what you must." Rahaz stood. "Good then, strip down and lay here on this table." He started clearing the table of its clutter. Faisan eased himself to his feet again. He unlaced his lamella and winced as he peeled the tunic from his wound. His skin was a translucent white from loss of blood. He lay down on the table and moved his arm so Rahaz could inspect the wounds. "This is bad," Rahaz said. "Even if we were to extract the creature, these stab wounds would kill you anyway. But there is a solution." Rahaz left him on the table and shuffled through some of the bottles on the shelves. Faisan struggled to see what was happening, but it was too difficult to move. When Rahaz returned, he directed Faisan to lay on his side, with his wounded side up. "Just lay still. This may hurt." Rahaz poured a fluid into the stab wounds. It felt icy cold as it coated his skin and ran down into his lung, searing the wound with cold as it did so. He had become all too familiar with the feeling of fluid in his lung, and, for a moment, he thought he would drown after all. Then he breathed in sharply, and there was no pain or bubbling of blood. In fact, he felt no sensation from the lung at all. It seemed still and dead. He could only feel the other lung functioning. "What did you do?" Faisan asked. "Is it healed?" "It's not going to kill you anymore," Rahaz said, directing him to return to his back. "Now, let's see what this thing inside you is." Asghar whispered a prayer as he touched his forehead to the prayer rug. A sudden, hideous cry from outside made him shoot up straight. Was that the camels? There was a desperate clamor and a cry from the beasts. Asghar ran to a window. He strained to see the camels, but with the thick pain and the dark of the night, he could make nothing out. All was silent, save the wind and blowing sand. There was a frantic knock at the door. Asghar jumped. He looked toward the door and heard the shrill wind again. There was another knock. It sounded desperate. No sane person would travel in these conditions. "Hello?" Asghar asked tentatively as he started back toward the main room and the door. There was a third knock. This time it was less desperate, but more substantial and deliberate. "Hello?" Asghar asked again.
"Who's there?"
His voice quavered, and he moved his ear close to the door. There was someone on the other side. The person beat the door again with what sounded like their whole forearm. Asghar strained, and he thought he could hear someone on the other side trying to speak. Suddenly, it came to him.
"Habibi?"
Asghar asked.
"Habibi, is that you?"
He heard the voice trying to speak again. It was. Asghar began to lift the bar from the door, but something pushed it back down. Asghar looked around, saw nothing, and so pulled the bar up again, overcoming whatever resistance there was. He dropped the bar to the floor and cracked the door open. The dim light of the fire fell upon Habibi, leaning heavily against the doorframe. His clothing was ripped, and his flesh was shredded. Deep claw marks ran from his one remaining ear, across what was left of his nose and mouth. He had tried to wrap himself in whatever he had left to protect him from the sandstorm, but that had been little enough. He was nursing a bloody and mangled left arm. A jackal laughed somewhere in the distance.
"Praise be to Allah,"
Asghar said, swinging the door wide. Habibi took a stumbling step inside and fell, but Asghar caught him before he hit the floor.
"Habibi, you are alive. We would never have left you."
Asghar hauled Habibi across the floor and laid him near the fireplace. Dark red blood dripped from the corners of Habibi's mouth.
"Allah be merciful,"
Asghar said as he inspected Habibi's body with his hands. There were claw marks all over him, and bites where the neck joined the shoulder. A large chunk of flesh had been ripped away.
"We thought you were dead. Praise Allah, you are not."
Asghar worked to remove Habibi's clothes so his wounds might be better inspected and dressed. Habibi was barely breathing, and his heart stirred little blood. He seemed to have lost his powers of speech. He lay trembling by the firelight and gurgled from time to time.
"Stay here,"
Asghar told him.
"I will find something to help you."
Asghar stood and went frantically from one room to another, looking for anything to help alleviate Habibi's suffering, often calling back to him words of assurance. Then, suddenly, he became aware of an uncomfortable stillness and quiet in the house.
"Habibi?"
Asghar asked into the emptiness. He cocked his head, but could no longer hear him.
"Habibi, are you all right?"
Asghar walked quickly back to the main room, where he had left his friend, but the floor was empty.
"Habibi?"
Asghar asked, looking left and right. There was no answer.
"Habibi?"
The hairs on Asghar's neck went stiff when a creature in the rafters issued a bestial roar. Its brown, stringy flesh stretched as it opened its mouth unnaturally wide, revealing sharp, yellow teeth.
"Allah, Allah!"
he cried as he ran from the room.
"Allah, be merciful!"
The creature leapt to the floor and charged after him with an inhuman gait. A pitcher of water lifted from its perch and poured itself into a large and shallow brass bowl. Rahaz waved his hands over the bowl as he spoke in a low murmur. He then washed his hands ritualistically and touched them to his forehead and chest again, murmuring something in a language Faisan did not understand. "Lay still," Rahaz said. Rahaz laid his left hand down flat against Faisan's stomach and applied light pressure. He touched Faisan with his right thumb and pressed down. Faisan felt a sharp prick, and then Rahaz drew his thumb across his abdomen. Faisan's flesh parted as though Rahaz wielded a surgeon's scalpel. There was no pain, and only a small rivulet of blood trickled to the table. When the incision was made, Rahaz slid his fingers inside, probing with them. The creature inside Faisan squirmed. "There is much corruption in you." Rahaz pulled out a wad of something akin to blackened and decaying vegetable matter. He shook it off his hand, and it splattered on the table. "I am going to try coaxing the creature out," Rahaz said, rinsing his hands in the bowl. "Remain still." There was no point in objecting now, so Faisan tried to relax. Rahaz waved his hands over the incision and spoke in a hissing whisper that sounded not unlike the language the thing whispered to him through his bones. Faisan felt the creature slide inside him, and he heard it answer with a whisper of its own. The creature relaxed in a way he had never experienced before. Then Faisan watched as a thin tentacle, shimmering with slime and blood, rose from the incision. "By Allah," Faisan said. The tentacle twisted and curled as it tested the air and its new environment, waving hypnotically to Rahaz's hands and words. The tentacle slapped down across Faisan's stomach with a splatter, and he felt its suckers grip his skin. Rahaz kept chanting, seeming to be in a trance himself. Another tentacle rose from the incision, and then another. Faisan heard a low cry in his bones, strangely like an infant.
Master, a ghoul!
Asgar cried as he stumbled into the prayer hall. There was not much time, but slowly and silently the mihrab began to open.
Thanks be to Allah,
Asgar said as he made a break toward it. He cast his gaze over his shoulder, just long enough to see the feral ghoul crouching in the archway to the prayer hall. It was coming for him. Asgar opened the mihrab just enough to pass through. He turned to slam it, but the ghoul's clawed hand slipped through the barely open crack and stopped him from pushing it shut. The ghoul roared again. Asgar pushed on the door, but the ghoul pushed back.
Allah help me!
Asgar whimpered just as the creature overpowered him, flung the door open, and then seized him by the face. He tried to pull away, but the creature held him by the skull, one claw through his eye, and another through his mouth. There was no escape, and the ghoul threw him to the stone floor by his skull. With his single good eye, Asgar watched the creature bound on top of him. Its bony knees dug into his chest. The ghoul screeched again. He felt it bury its teeth in his neck and rip the flesh from his throat. Asgar saw his blood running down the ghoul's body as the beast swallowed a chunk of his flesh. He turned his face away and watched his blood drip down the stairs. Faisan watched another slimy tentacle rise from his body. Nothing in his dreams had prepared him for this. He had so many questions, but instinct told him he should not interrupt Rahaz's chant. There was a creaking squeal as the door to the laboratory opened. Faisan started, and the tentacle creature tensed. Rahaz paused his chant. "I told you we were not to be disturbed," Faisan called toward the door. There was the sound of slow footfalls entering the room, and a hazy shadow from the torch fell across the floor. "What's wrong?" Faisan demanded, but there was no answer. Asgar emerged from under the stone archway. His face had been raked to the bone, and his blood dripped on the stones. A large chunk of flesh was missing from his neck, and he had been brutally blinded in one eye. "Asgar!" Faisan exclaimed, but Asgar did not respond. Instead, he staggered from the doorway, stumbled to the floor before the table, and looked up at them with his single glassy eye, evidently delirious from the loss of blood and the trauma that had befallen him. "What happened to you?" Faisan asked.
Asgar, what happened? Tell me.
Faisan felt the creature inside him become angry, thrash, and start to wrap around his organs again. Rahaz recoiled from the table. "Stay away from him," Rahaz said. He raised his hands to begin some incantation, but it was too little too late. Like the ripples of water from a stone cast into a lake, the features of Asgar's shredded face were replaced with a skull-like head, with brown pitted flesh stretched over it, the visage of a desert ghoul. The ghoul's jaw dropped open, and it howled mercilessly. Faisan fumbled for his sword. The ghoul leapt over the table with an agility that defied its bony physique. It raised its claws like knives from their sheaths. The ghoul sprang on top of Rahaz with its feet on his chest and drove him to the floor. Its long claws tore open his throat with a spray of red. Whatever words Rahaz tried to speak were lost in a gargle of blood. The sudden excitement disturbed the creature in Faisan, and it twisted and squeezed. He heaved, trying to regain his breath, and drew his sword from its sheath. The steel in his hand gave him comfort. The ghoul crouched over Rahaz, with its knees spread wide, pulling the flesh from his body with its claws. The chamber echoed with Rahaz's agony. The creature turned its head unnaturally far around to stare at Faisan as he readied his sword. The ghoul's jaw dropped and issued a hellish roar. The thing inside Faisan twisted, and he felt the tentacles still outside his body pull away and then suction again. It was trying to worm its way back between his organs and cower inside his body. There was no time to think of that, however, and Faisan prepared for battle. The ghoul glared at Faisan with its shriveled eyes and lunged. Faisan parried its claw strike and counterattacked, but the ghoul blocked. Then it came at him with a frenzied attack, and Faisan knew he could not ward it off for long. There was a ferocious growl, but this time it was not from the ghoul. From the corner of his eye, Faisan saw the jackal. It lunged at the ghoul and clamped its jaw like a vice down on its arm, shaking it violently. That was the opening Faisan needed. He swung his sword, and it bit into the ghoul's neck of stringy flesh. The blade did not cut the creature's head off so much as tear it off. The ghoul's head flew from its shoulders, spun through the air, struck the stone wall, and bounced across the floor. The jackal bounded over to the head and gnawed on it, growling and slobbering. And yet, despite the loss of its head, the ghoul's body remained upright. The spidery lingerings of ancient blood vessels protruded from its severed neck, and sand-like blood ran from the wound. The body staggered as it tried to steady itself with outstretched arms, and it took a couple of tentative steps, flailing its claws in search of Faisan. A moment later, the ghoul dropped to the floor in a nerveless mass and laid still. Faisan gasped for breath, safe from the ghoul's attack. But the battle had widened the incision in his abdomen. It was dripping dark blood much faster now. Tentacles still wriggled from it, half submerged in the grisly, bloody soup of his entrails. He propped himself on the table and looked down at Rahaz, laying still. The ghoul had severed his jugular, and Rahaz's blood pooled around him. The jackal was nudging Rahaz with his muzzle and licking his face, but Rahaz did not move. All in the chamber was quiet and still. The end seemed near, after all. The creature moved in the wound, and Faisan looked down at it. What he had thought was one of his exposed organs might actually be the creature. "I think we have now come to the end," Faisan said, gripping his sword. There seemed to be no way out now. He could probably drive his sword through it and himself at the same time. Then it would all be over. As he pondered, the creature's mass moved in a boneless ripple of muscle, and its skin opened, revealing an oblong pupil in a red iris. It looked out from his abdomen and over the room. Faisan saw its eyes settle on Alhazred's skull. Then it started to emerge. Its tentacles slithered out from between his organs and slapped across his body. Faisan dropped his sword and pulled on it as its bulbous form pushed its way out of the incision. It seemed to cry as he drew it from the moist warmth of his body. Then all at once, the rest of it slid out, and Faisan was left holding a formless mass of tentacles. He dropped it and collapsed. He felt more free and loose than he had since Alhazred had conjured the thing inside him so long ago. The creature landed on the stone floor with a wet splat, its writhing tentacles covered in blood and slime. It had a wide mouth with needle-like teeth beneath its red eye. Cautiously, it crawled backwards away from him. The jackal sniffed the creature, and the thing turned its eye to inspect the jackal with caution. Faisan stared at the creature, and it stared back. It seemed as uncertain as he was about what was to happen next. A long pink tongue slid from its mouth, and it licked its eyeball. Faisan's sword was still near at hand. It seemed the thing knew what his sword was, and what it could do. Not long ago, Faisan would have butchered it without hesitation. Now, he had a strangely different feeling. Did he see a tinge of fear in its eye? Faisan had never really thought the creature would ever be removed from him. Now, a part of him recognized it as, if not exactly his child, at least something of his own body. He had fed it with his life's blood, and it had spoken to him. And now there it was, a seemingly helpless mass trying to understand its new reality. Could it still need him? The tongue lapped up blood from the pool around Rahaz's body. Faisan felt a strange sense of jealousy. Had it not fed on his blood all these years? Faisan pushed his sword away and held out his hand to the creature. "It's all right," he said. "Come here. Come." The creature hesitated, but Faisan tried to reassure it and gestured again. "Come here." At last the creature slid toward him, using its massive tentacles for locomotion. Faisan reached out with his hand, palm upward, and the thing tentatively extended a slimy tentacle and touched his fingers. When no harm came to it, the tentacle slid further up his hand, and then another and another. It was not long before the slimy mass of wriggling tentacles was sliding up him, and Faisan cradled it in the crook of his arm. Its tongue laid across his stomach wound, rolling in his blood. It cooed softly, and, as it fed, its single eye looked up at Faisan with something that, in some strange way, might be called affection. But this could not last. He could not go on with his entrails exposed like this. The jackal padded over. It brought him one of the ghoul's hands it had torn off. "Thank you," he said, and with his free hand he playfully rubbed the jackal. His hand brushed the jackal's wound. He looked at the stab wounds on his own side. There was a strange similarity in how they had been healed. Faisan looked up at the bottle Rahaz had left on the table, and it floated over to him. He uncorked and smelled it. It was odorless. Faisan looked at his abdomen. It was all a bloody ruin. There seemed to be nothing to lose, and no other option, so he tipped the bottle and poured its contents into the wound. It smoked and sizzled as the fluid washed the blood away. Faisan grunted with the burning cold. Then there was no sensation from the wound at all. The bleeding stopped. Where there had once been red, tender tissue, his flesh was cold, grey, dead, and numb. He touched the skin that curled away from the wound. There was no sensation in it. It was as if he touched someone else's rubbery skin. 2 needles drifted from a shelf and threaded themselves. He was too weak to object, even if he had wanted to, and so the needles went about their work, piercing his nerveless flesh and drawing it together with every careful pass. When they had finished, unseen hands tied and cut the thread. "It's okay now," Faisan said, offering an assurance to the creature. It stared up at him with its single eye, and then slithered further up his arm to his shoulder. Faisan got up and stood before the bone-crowned skull. "Is this it? Is this what you wanted?" Faisan demanded as he stared into its hollow eyes, but there was no answer. All was quiet, and the skull was still as stone. Faisan looked down at the book, touched its pages, and read. "Ready body and mind for a journey daunting, lest you join the husks of supplicants found wanting, under the canopy of black limbs taunting. From the ages memories flood, succor on the black tree's blood." A thin line of sap-like fluid, black as pitch, ran from the skull's eyes. The creature on his shoulder stretched out with its mass toward the skull. Faisan took it down from its niche. The creature flicked its tongue over one of the skull's cheekbones, lapping up the running fluid. Faisan felt an urge to do the same. He licked the skull from teeth to eye socket and rolled the liquid around in his mouth. It was sharp and foul. Faisan looked over to the creature on his shoulder as it inched closer to him. Its tentacles wrapped around his head, and it moved its toothy and lipless mouth to his ear. Faisan heard its alien voice echo in his skull, but this time he could understand its words. "Beyond the tree, beyond the world, and beyond time, Yog-Sothoth awaits the worthy." If you enjoyed this production, please subscribe to the channel and join Infinite Black's Inner Circle on Patreon for behind-the-scenes access and to receive more Journey to the Tree of Sorrows materials.